Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Doomer Optimism podcast. Rotating hosts and rotating guests. I am joined by Tress Crow. Tress, how are you doing?
I'm wonderful. I'm
yeah.
doing great. I'm doing great. This is a lovely time of night to be having a podcast discussion.
For sure. And our special guest today is Ethan Holmes. And Ethan, I'm going to read the bio that you sent us. So Ethan, Charles Holmes, better known as the Post from Underground Online, is a journalist with an international newswire and an independent writer who focuses on culture, politics, and philosophy. Ethan is a longtime resident of Montana, having grown up in the state and graduated from the University of Montana in Missoula with degrees in Russian and political science. He focuses on topics including political theory, international relations, localism, complex systems, Dostoyevsky, and of course, Doomer Optimism. All right, well, Ethan, I read the bio that you sent me, but why don't you flesh that out a little bit?
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you guys for having me on this podcast. It was a pleasure listening to the first couple episodes, pleasure to see it launched. So I'm glad to be participating in one of these great discussions with you guys. I guess the reason why someone like myself, someone with my background in news writing and politics, culture, philosophy, was so interested by this idea of Doomer Optimism when I came across it was because it touches on so many important areas of life and the intellectual discourse on there, both in academia and on places like Twitter. Because Doomer Optimism, at least in my perspective, feel free to add on or fight back on this, it touches on tech, on art, on culture and philosophy and politics. It even cuts into things like agriculture, nutrition, local systems. And so the fact that it touches so many areas and has so much to say about such a broad breadth of issues was really attractive to me. And so to be able to talk about these as sort of an intellectual jack of all trades is really exciting.
Yeah, well, it definitely is sufficiently vague that many people can kind of project onto it what they want, right?
Indeed.
And because many, people are black-pilled about several different things, right?
Yeah.
And they could be conflicting things, conflicting epistemologies of how they view the world, which is interesting. And I argue that it's kind of, it's kind of a version of an older kind of mythology, that is probably best represented in Christianity, but others as well, kind of like, resurrection, birthing out of crucifixion and death, right? So anyway, yeah, it's interesting that you found a resonance with that. How do you, like, in what particular way would you say that you've found resonance? Like you mentioned kind of different topic areas, but is there one particular, and maybe we can even, I'll even mention right now, we don't have to go into it now, but you sent us a couple of articles. One is the Bloomer oscillation. And it seems like a Doomer optimist is the bloomer, like that, because the bloomer, according to your article, has kind of gone through this stage of existential despair and has come out, basically focusing on what, their sphere of influence and their sphere of concern, and is kind of empowered by that. And so just thought I'd throw that in there. But yeah, anyway, you want to go into a little bit more about like how that meme maps onto what you've been thinking about for some time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that setup with you having mentioned the Christ metaphor and even the seasonal metaphor. Because to me, yeah, the bloomer is like the spring, right? Where it's gone through the winter, the doomer winter, which comes with its hardships, its crises of faith and optimism. And then you're coming out of that with a renewed sense of knowledge and appreciation in the spring. But the spring's a call to action, right? You also have to get planted and get to work, because it's if there's one thing that I've really come to believe, it's that history seems to be cyclical, or at least very patterned. And so I think there will be future generations of Doomer optimists too, and we're just kind of the contemporary iteration of them. But the meme aspect of it is actually kind of what got me interested. The name Doomer Optimist, for those who may be unfamiliar, seems to be rooted in the Doomer meme, which came about a couple of years ago. And I did a deep dive into the etymology of Doomer and Doomer Optimism to try and get a solid timeline on these ideas. And what I found was pretty exciting, pretty shocking. Doomer, I think you guys wouldn't disagree, it seems to be a play on boomer, right? Boomer is kind of the first oomer of the words out there. And correct me if I'm wrong, you guys aren't boomers by any means.
I mean, I'd agree with that. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't really know where I first heard it. You know, I do know that it was at least 10 years ago where it was starting to kind of bubble up around the kind of concept of a prepper, right? A doomsday prepper, right? A doomer is a doomsday prepper, you know, kind of thing. Seemed like a portmanteau to me in a way, like doomer or doomsday prepper, doomer, right?
Absolutely, and that was something that I didn't quite realize as someone who is quite young, who is in the Zoomer category of these Zoomers. I was pretty young when the big the interest in the media and prepping culture, at least, kind of hit its heyday there with the National Geographic shows and the like. And so reading about this culture around the Doomers, the picnic culture is what it is called by Wikipedia, in the early to mid 2000s, did indeed coin the term Doomer before the meme came about. And that shocked me as someone who was certain that Doomer originated as a meme term. And I wanted to read this line because I think we see the early hints of Doomer optimism even with this earliest use of Doomer. From the Wikipedia alone, take it as a source as you will. Not all of the peakniks, Doomers, subscribe to a fatalist outlook. One of them, when writing recommendations on how to survive the societal collapse, suggested that his fellow Doomers, quote, adopt a positive attitude because, as he put it, hard times don't last, but hard people do. And when I read that, that seemed to me to at least be hinting at a lot of the things that Doomer optimists in this current circle have been talking about. Would you guys agree that that seems to be hinting early on at this idea of Doomers not as negative, but honestly resilient?
Yeah, I would say so. I think that's pretty good foreshadowing. Yeah, I mean, so for me, you know, this kind of meme kind of grabbed my attention because I was kind of getting fed up with the naive optimism that I was seeing, especially in kind of technology sectors. And it felt like it was unearned. And perhaps that's my religious sensibility, but it was unearned in kind of an existential sense of, you know, you can't have things for free. There is a cost to things. And, you know, these ideas that we're just going to continue this flywheel of progress and overcome all of these inconvenient challenges, you know, without some kind of flesh taken, you know, it rubbed me the wrong way. And so this notion that, you know, in order to be truly optimistic, you have to go down into hell for a while. And that could be personal tragedy, that could be your personal, you know, it could be existential angst in your late teens and early 20s, you know, or it could be reckoning with, you know, existential risk that, you know, there's many kinds of existential risk that you can agonize over. And it's coming out the other side more sober, but also, you know, and also, you know, in a spiritual sense, coming to terms with mortality in general, and, you know, coming to terms with death, and, you know, realizing that, you know, in a way, or, you know, our short lifespan, we're already dead, but things are still arising, and it's beautiful and it's wondrous, right? And so it's just, to me, it seemed much more meaningful and profound to have an optimism that was rooted out of that. And so, yeah, you know, hard times don't last, but hard men do, hard women. Yeah, but I would want to unpack the hardness, right? What does that mean? It's not like, you know, having trauma that's just been scabbed over without being processed, right? You know, that could help you to be a good prepper, but I think that in the fuller sense of the concept for me, it's not just about being a hardened kind of emotionally stunted prepper. You know, it's the full sense of the term.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think fleshing out what that hardness looks like, what long-term resilience or the adaptations that we want to make should look like is the sort of conversations that are coming out of things like the Doomer Optimist movement, where people aren't just saying, you know, the end is nigh, so I got to look out for my own, and just prep up materially. It is about looking at overcoming the challenges of this kind of this eve of the modern age and this dawn of whatever weird thing is starting to emerge in the world. You know, what changes we need to start thinking about and making now. And that gets to the crux of something you guys were hinting at earlier with my work with the Doomer-Bloomer oscillation, as I like to call it. And this, going back to the seasonal metaphor, this transition that comes from hard times, dark times, you know, grappling with uncomfortable truths, to doing something positive, beautiful, you know, productive and creative with that energy. But really quickly, I wanted to spend a little more time on what really Doomer optimism is to both myself and you guys. For me, it seems, I wrote down a couple things here on the list that it seemed to me to be relatively core tenets of Doomer optimism of most strains and varieties, as we noted, there's many there, but it seems to be acceptably anti-utopian, and that I don't think the optimism and the sorts of systems that most of the Doomer optimists out there seem to be striving for would be called utopian. I think part of the Doomer realism is recognizing we can do better, we can even do much better, but that perfection seems to be a fool's errand in many ways. Also, an emphasis on personal and local action. That is that making the changes most immediate to you are often going to be the most productive in terms of resiliency, happiness, you know, minimal negative impact. And then also experimentation seemed to be a big aspect and core tenet of this Doomer optimist movement. I think that the diversity and viewpoints we see in it are reflective of the experimentation out there, and the core need for experimentation to be almost held as a good, like, normative value in and of itself, because how else are we going to figure out these weird problems, these novel problems of our day and age, if we don't experiment in a variety of ways? And I think that's why we're accepting as a movement too, is we're willing to say, in terms of that local and personal action, be willing to go out there and be the first to try something, the first to give something a shot, because it might turn out to be something that can help all the Doomer optimists out there. Would you guys say that those seem to be three at least broad tenets that seem to be common across the movement with people you've talked to?
I would agree with that. I think that, you know, I kind of love the idea of bringing on guests and having them try and describe Doomer optimism, right? Because it's almost like it's a Rorschach test in a way. Like, I mean, there's certain attributes, right, which almost are almost like wrapped up in the term itself, right? You have to be both a doomer and optimistic in some capacity. Now, how doom and gloom you are and how optimistic you are wildly vary, right? I love the kind of anti-utopianism in that. I'd say almost take it a click further and say we're sort of anti-opianism in general. Like, we're sort of anti-dystopia too. Although I think there's a lot of, there's definitely a fear of dystopia, right? I'd argue we're living in the dystopia currently. Like, you know, I mean, this is the dystopia. My mom has always been very like fond of saying, hell, Earth is hell, right? Like, we are in hell and everything is all upside from here. But I really like that anti-utopianism, because that's the thing that, like, the two ends of it, like, I feel like on one end you get like techno-utopianism, or sort of like those classic like solar punk images, which just like make my skin crawl, because I'm like, that looks like an Le Corbusier like drawing of what he was going to do to Paris in the 1920s. It's a freaking nightmare. We know it's a nightmare because it's Cabrini Green, right? We built it here and then we destroyed it because it was absolutely pathological. But then the other end of it is what we've been calling like cottagecore, right? Which is this utopian, it's homesteading with all of the rough edges sanded off, right? And it's pure aesthetics. And I think like there's definitely, I think like Doomer optimists do seem to be like running away from either end of that sort of like spectrum. But where we fall on it though, it's like wildly different. I mean, I think like I'm not a homesteader, right? I actually am very consciously throwing my lot in with urban centers, right? That's the work I do. That's my belief that like, you know, the reason why I believe that, you know, a quick gloss of it is just that like, it has been, our urban centers have been essentially the resting ground, or like the magnet for all of our cultural, social, financial, human resources over centuries now. And to abandon them seems like, to me, just seems kind of short-sighted, right? That like, it's difficult. It's very hard work to reform the urban centers, but I actually think it can be done. It's a long shot, but if it can be done, it's going to be very worthwhile versus all these people flooding out to the rural periphery and like causing all sorts of mess out in the, you know, I just feel like we should probably be trying to make the urban centers workable if possible, because that will help the transition, I feel like, versus everyone fleeing out of the cities, which already, I mean, all of our, and this is my last point, kind of tangential to that, is that like a lot of our Northeastern colleagues, you know, who are homesteaders, that's a major complaint of theirs, right? Is that so many people left New York City and Philadelphia and all of these Northeast, you know, cities and have flooded into upstate New York and New England. And it's causing a lot of problems. Like it's gentrifying these areas in a very uncomfortable way. And so I think like, you know, making the cities more livable is an important thing. But that's where I land, right? And I'm sure Jason would have a different viewpoint on the urban-rural dichotomy. And I know several of the homesteaders we've had on the podcast already would disagree with me on that, you know? And yet we're aligned, right? We're still aligned. We still accept that we're on the same spectrum, right? We're at least all seeing the world somewhat through the same lens.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that once again, that difference between the super rural focused Doomer optimists out there and those who are more willing to keep the city urban model shows that we're willing to experiment and kind of see what comes out of the actions that we take now. And I actually think this was on a post of Jason's from a while back now, where I made a comment about a lot of people out there wanting 20 acres and a 20 gigabyte internet connection, right? Where if they could kind of have the best of both worlds, a lot of people would find a meaningful and content life there. And that's what we are kind of seeing with people fleeing urban areas to more rural ones. I'm from Montana, for example. We see a lot of people from more coastal states, more urban areas coming and buying property up here, living here either full time or at least seasonally. And it has a bunch of second, third order impacts, of course. There's identity, state dynamics at play. You know, tribalism gets into play there for better or for worse. And so I see that on a regular basis as well. But I'm not going to ever blame someone who wants to leave a city if they feel they would have a better life out in the country. But on the same note, I'm also not going to say that cities are going to disappear anytime soon. Clearly, they're hubs of humanity. With civilization comes cities and dense living. And like you said, it's going to be a lot of work to renovate these cities, to reinvigorate them. And we can have this conversation if we want. I think a lot of it is architecturally based. I think American cities in particular are terrible architecturally in terms of fostering social connection, social capital, you know, real genuine human relationships. And we can change that for sure. It's not out of the realm of possibility. It's just a matter of will and having people like us talk to people with more power and more money to help do those things maybe in the future. But for now, that's where the emphasis on individual and local action is, right? Is we can start maybe building our own homesteads with a fast internet connection, or our, you know, urban flat with a rooftop garden or a greenhouse nearby. So I just think that whole conversation there once again points to the Doomer optimists' willingness to experiment and be open to the experimentation of others. But I think that's also a good transition here to the Doomer-Bloomer oscillation, because the Doomer might say, I'll have no choice but to live in a homestead with all the rough edges. And the Bloomer might say, I don't have to lift the naive Bloomer, I should say, might say, I don't have to lift a finger and things will eventually turn out for the best. And I think the Doomer, those who go through the Doomer-Bloomer oscillation, those who we might call Doomer Optimists, I think realize that a better future is possible, but you do have to lift a finger, and you have to be the one to lift your own finger, because no one's going to do it for you. And this gets to the generational thing as well, right? I wrote the Doomer-Bloomer oscillation thinking that maybe it was a specifically generational feeling. At the time, I thought, it seems to be a lot of young people I've talked to who are feeling this way. I didn't have a ton of interaction with older groups, conversations, and older circles, to realize at that point that this is a much broader issue and it's not generation specific. And so that's where I think there's value to ask you guys, as someone who's had so many more, not many, but several more years on this earth than myself, to implement this Doomer Optimist way of thinking. What steps, what personal action and experiments have you guys taken, or would you recommend young people take based on what you've learned in order to have a lifestyle conducive to Doomer optimism? Freudian slip there.
I don't know if I would hold up my life as an example of anything, because I've taken a lot of wrong turns. Well, maybe that's the advice, is you going back to experimentation. I think it would probably be helpful to learn some practical skills. Just to get right down to it. It's something that I didn't really focus on. I was basically in academia, all through my 20s and most of my 30s, and I think I really missed out on. I did some like small, temporary, construction, various kind of odd jobs, but to, spend a summer on a permacultural farm, or, spend 3 months in another country, particularly, a much poorer country. That I think is definitely helpful, and that was helpful for me. I did a lot of traveling in my 20s and early 30s. I think you have to experiment with yourself, and because it's really, this is a cliche, but young people go through a certain period where they think they know who they are and they think they know what they want, but without kind of a diversity of experiences, it's hard to say if you know what you want, because you haven't found expression necessarily in all aspects of yourself. So that's one thing. I don't know. Do you have anything, Tres?
Well, I really applaud you, Ethan. You've managed to somehow turn this into you're interviewing us, which I think is really fascinating. Yeah, I think I'm the oldest one here. I think I'm what they're calling a geriatric millennial now. I think I'm like literally the cutoff, right? Like I'm the first year you could be a millennial, or the last year you could be a Gen Xer. What's very fascinating is growing up, I always really identified with Gen X. Like I really thought, I was raised on Nirvana and Green Day, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm a Gen Xer, right? But the older I get, I think that my economic situation, like the way I've been kind of caught in the wash of the financial crisis, and like the way that all of that dynamic has played out in my life, is actually much more millennial than it is Gen X. And I identify much more with the millennials now. But I'm as old as you can be. I'm 40, so I'm as old as you can be, and to be considered a millennial. But I think, it's funny, if you were asking me these kind of this kind of a question, I come down to more like old man, like life lesson type of stuff, which I think would have been just as applicable 100 years ago as it is today, which is find your tribe and be useful to them, right? Like that's the most fundamental thing. And that's actually why I've latched on to Doomer Optimism so much, is because I've been a Doomer since I read Geography of Nowhere by James Howard Kunstler in 2001, right? He named the feeling I felt going around Detroit, going around these car suburbs. Like, he named it. He said, these are pathological dysfunctional environments that create a pathological dysfunctional society, right? We are our built environment and vice versa. And I realized, like, man, wow, America is really fucked up. And then we went into the Iraq war and Afghanistan, and all of that was just such a mess. And then they said, the theory was peak oil was 2006, right? 2 years later, gigantic financial collapse, right? Like, and everything, it just felt like it's slapping Band-Aids on it. And so this whole time I've been getting like more, and like the pill just got blacker and blacker for me. But I think Doomer Optimism came at a really perfect moment for me, because I realized that, like, my nihilism was not doing anyone any good, let alone me, right? It wasn't doing any good. And that's why I thought your definition of the bloomer was so beautiful, is that it really described that feeling that kind of led me to the Doomer Optimism kind of milieu. Because I felt like, clearly the world's going to hell in a handbasket, right? But I have no idea what that means. And unless I'm going to off myself, I might as well be productive and useful to the people around me. I also have kids. I don't know how this affects you, Jason, but I can tell you, kids it's like taking all your chips and putting them on the table, right? You can't walk away from the table because you got all your chips on there. You at least got to see how the hand plays out, right? And I have found, my kids are my biggest driver for the type of work that I do and the type of seeking that I've done. So I think there's a lot of debate about whether you should or shouldn't have kids. I'm very much on the side that if you want them, absolutely you should have them, because it is the closest equivalent I've had to a religious experience. I was one person going into that birthing room, and I was one person coming out of it. Completely different. It changed everything about my life and the way I view the world. And so it kind of kicked my doomerism into a high gear. And that optimism has come in, and I realized that it was community. That was this tangent was to get to the community piece, is that you have to find a community, and you have to be willing to be useful to that community. So to reiterate what you said, Jason, a practical skill, my skill is storytelling, right? I don't have many practical skills, but storytelling is actually a pretty practical skill, especially when you're trying to convince people or talk to people about ideas, right? It's actually a pretty practical skill. I've been trying gardening, and I have gotten better. I managed to get 30 sweet peppers off my pepper plant this year. I'm very proud of it. So I'm starting to grow, and that's one way I'm heading into there. But I would absolutely reiterate what you said, Jason, about practical skills, finding your community, finding a way you can be useful in any way. And I don't think you don't have to make big, grand gestures, right? I mean, when you're talking about the scale of the problems, a grand gesture is no different than a small gesture, really. Like the scales we're talking about, right? It's like, donating $1,000 versus $1 in $1 trillion economy. What freaking difference does it make, right? Just donate what you can. And in fact, that gets back to, the biblical story of, the widow who gave her last, pence or last pennies to the synagogue, right? And to the temple. And, Jesus saying that she has a place in heaven where the richest man does not, is that because she gave everything. She gave what she could. And I believe that's what we should do with our communities.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm so glad that you guys were willing to give me those sorts of answers. I obviously didn't intend for it to turn into an interview of you, but I'm a very curious person. I do come from the news, so maybe it's just a tendency to want to hear what you guys have to say. But I think it's also valuable to hear honest answers like that, authentic answers like that from folks like yourself, because I know there's a lot of young people, my age and younger, who want to hear those sorts of answers. It's why there's clearly a huge demand online for people to share their kind of just their general life wisdom, no matter how benign it may seem to that person. I think a lot of people do benefit from hearing the good and bad from others. And there's a couple things that you both touched on there that really make me wish that the folks from Rhizoma were here, especially when it comes to learning practical skills. And as you said, getting out there and having, maybe an experience working in an agricultural setting, because they were one of the first exposures I had on Twitter to this sort of thinking. And it was inspiring to see what they were doing there, really putting their money and their time and their labor where their mouth was. And one thing that I've had a conversation with them about in a Twitter space was, like you were saying, the impact of having a kid. And as someone who right now is in their early 20s with peers or in the same age range, the number who have zero interest in having children is astounding. It's probably unprecedented, at least in human history, as far as I can tell, in terms of the sheer number who just have no interest in this sort of thing. And as a doomer, I understand it, right? I understand the black pill that makes you not want to bring another conscious human life into the world. But as a bloomer, I see that the absolute unlimited creative potential in a human life. And I've seen the kind of joy and meaning and motivation it can bring to people. And so I think that is important advice, that if you find yourself, wanting kids, but feeling dissuaded by the black pill, by the doomerism of whatever problem is irking you and keeping you down, that perhaps there are second order silver linings, that there are impacts for the better, that maybe can take you from that state of doomer antinatalism to maybe a sort of bloomer, at least, willingness to consider the positive impact of bringing another life into the world. Because it is a tough decision. I think it always has been for people who know the hardness of life, the difficulties, and knowing that you're bringing in someone to experience it, right? It is kind of jarring. I'm not a parent, but you just, in the abstract, it's jarring to me. So I can't imagine, people like yourselves who have actually gone through that transformational experience as you described it. And I think that once again goes to anti-utopianism. You have to realize you might be bringing someone into a tough world, but that you and they will be able to do something about it to make it bearable, beautiful, to find a community. And I've said this many times in the past, people don't care for liberty and freedom all that much if they don't have community to share it with first, right? You can give someone all the ability, the freedom to do as they wish, when they want, and very often it'll be meaningless to them without people to share that liberty and freedom with, alongside, to do things with, to have genuine social human bonds with. And I try not to be explicitly political a lot of the time online, although it's hard to avoid it. But one of the things that I think Doomer Optimism has to say, at least on the political front, is to think long-term about your communities in the most local of senses, right? I think a lot of people feel dissuaded from politics because they feel as though they won't have an impact on a national or let alone a global level. And I think they're entirely right, and that might be a doomer black pill, but the bloomer part is that it's actually remarkably easy to get involved on the local level, to build a connection with the people living within the closest square mile or two to you. I think most problems out there can be solved by just talking to your neighbor once in a while, right? I think if we just took the time to sit down and have a hot beverage with the neighbor, have a cold drink at the bar with the people who live around us, far more often we'd be better off politically, in terms of mental health, in terms of our economy, right? I think a lot of times we're so focused on the freedom of atomization that we forget that collective kind of invigorating spirit of being part of something bigger, especially here in the US. And Jason, the last thing I wanted to touch on is you said getting out to a poorer country in the world is one of the best things someone can do. One of my heroes in the world, Mr. Art Bell of Coast to Coast AM, made a very similar argument years ago about how the U.S. government would benefit from paying kids to go to a third world country for a year in their late teens, early 20s, and learn the wisdom of that experience. I myself went to Siberia, of all places, which is considerably poorer and considerably colder. And although I was only there for a brief amount of time, I definitely learned a lot more in my time there in terms of like informational input density than I did just sticking around my communities here in Montana. So I would also echo that sentiment of getting out in the world and seeing people who maybe have learned to cope with much tougher circumstances and produced incredibly beautiful things.
Yeah, and this is kind of a vague generality. It's not universally true, but also tend to have stronger social bonds because they have to, right? There's real felt, functional patterns of interdependency when you don't grow up in an environment, an atomized environment, with conspicuous consumption and these kinds of dreams that we've been fed. So I think that's helpful as well. Ethan, I want to bring in Dostoyevsky and perhaps the underground man. And this is, as you describe in the article, somebody who kind of takes some pleasure in their nihilism, in their broken heart. And also if you can, tie that to this kind of metamodern oscillation that you talk about in the other article.
Yes, two big things in front of us there with this discussion. So I guess I'll just dive right into it. Dostoyevsky was a writer I came across early on in my undergraduate degree and just fell in love with in the months and years following that initial reading of his work, Notes from Underground, which is where that's the namesake of my online account, Posts from Underground. And the reason I tie it to Doomer Optimism is because in many ways, I think Dostoyevsky was an original Doomer and an original Doomer Optimist. The character of the underground man, who is I'm not going to say antagonist or anti-hero, just the lead of Notes from Underground, seems to be the first Doomer. He is almost unbearably angsty in his writing. He is someone who clearly has genuine and legitimate complaints about the world and about life that you certainly empathize with, but he's just intentionally made to be annoying about how right and how whiny he is about the state of affairs. And for the historical context, this is being written in the relatively early stages of modernity in the early mid 1800s here. And so the underground man in many ways is the earliest iteration of the Doomer. And in the article you're referencing, I link him to modern movie characters such as the lead in Taxi Driver. You see the lead in Joker is also very much influenced by Dostoevsky and his underground man. But as much as the underground man and Dostoevsky in that early stage of his literary career was a Doomer, was kind of this black-pilled guy dealing with the issue of nihilism and this early kind of death of God concept. He was a relative contemporary of people like Nietzsche and an early starter of existentialism. But later on in his works and his career, you started seeing the optimist leak into his Doomer optimism. He was a devout Orthodox Christian, and he brought many of those themes into his writing. But even outside of a strictly religious context, you saw an optimism in the power of active love being professed throughout his novels, that this most social and human of connections of energies out there, this, as hokey as it may sound, love energy out there in the world, is actually a far more important and tangible power than people who may be very scientifically minded may like to admit. And I think with Doomer Optimism, we have that same energy, that genuine social human bonds, that focusing on things that bring us together into communities, that focusing on those things that are within our immediate personal control and sphere of influence are most important, because that's where love energy is produced. And one of my favorite scholars, Petiram Sorokin, an early father of sociology, was known for this idea of love energy as an actual productive force, where in the same way that we're measuring things like GDP and all these other demographic stats, we should be thinking about love energy, about social capital, people might link it to nowadays in like modern academic terms, that this is something we need to be far more focused on, because a lot of the economic and cultural and political woes that we complain about really seem as though they would be best remedied, or at least most easily remedied, by building communities that are high in the production of love energy, that are high in social capital and these bonding and bridging factors between people. And I think we have to look at it in all these broad areas that we mentioned at the beginning. We have to look at it in terms of architecture, in terms of value and culture and art. We have to look at it in terms of our political and our economic, our trade systems. All of these things play into the far more important and the underlying social human connections at play in all these. And I think if the Doomer Optimist is one thing, he's a social being like every man. And I think the Doomer Optimist is acutely aware that as much as society may black pill him, sociality is really the savior in this equation.
I had a follow-up question here. So, you've been talking about like localism and building community. Your topics also include political theory and international relations. So
opposite ends.
How do these? What's that? How do these graft on? Like how does what we've been talking about fit into this kind of larger context of what you've been thinking about political theory and international?
It's the oscillation, right? I mean, you're telling us, you've told us straight up that you're oscillating between poles.
I have a hard time making up my mind. Yeah, I like looking at things on the nitty gritty micro scale and the very broad 30,000 foot macro scale. And it's hard to, I actually struggle to reach that middle ground sometimes between the two.
So would you say that these two things are compartmentalized?
Yeah, this is one of my favorite discussions.
Synthesis between them.
Yeah. Sorry, I think that they fit one into the other, because I think one of the biggest ideas we should be promoting in international relations is these ideas of localism and local control and local economic and supply chain systems. A lot of the major problems that we see nowadays on the world stage stem from when international supply chains break down. Whether that be because some random ship blocks a canal, or because of ransomware and all these other like cyber attack issues, right? We see the fragility there in very, very large scale international trade and supply systems. And so then you don't really see that many people out there suggesting more localized supply chains as a pretty easy, obvious answer. We didn't have these problems before. And granted, I'm the first to concede that in terms of just getting people material goods and food and medicine, that global supply chain and trade system has done miraculous things. But I think to ignore the fact that it has resiliency issues linked to its degradation of local systems is something that needs to at least be addressed, or considered in the highest, the halls of Congress and the chambers of the UN and whatever. And in terms of relating to other countries as well, people often analogize states to individuals, right? This kind of biological analogy, the body politic, the Leviathan, however you want to frame it. And so just like we talked about the importance of sociality and human connections on that micro local scale, I think it really matters on the macro international relations scale between these Leviathans as well. If we could maybe taken a non-interventionist, realist approach to international relations, where we say, maybe we should be more concerned about growing our garden properly, right, than what my neighbor's planting in theirs. That's as sound of a logic in my community as it is on the world stage, right? Everyone wants to get involved on that global level and not get involved on the local level. And I think a lot of those problems that we're talking about on that global level we're hyper-focused on could be solved by approaching the global issues with a local perspective. I hate to say I would like to see a broad series of city-states and like county-sized regional powers in the world. But if the world were nothing but entities and communities governing themselves of that size, I would be perfectly content, because there'd be a lot of experimentation too, right? On that, linking global politics, localism, and Doomer optimism, I think experimentation's at that core, as well as anti-utopianism, to embrace such wide-scale experimentation among the local systems of the world. You have to embrace the fact and recognize that some of them are going to fail. Some of them are probably going to be just awful setups, and we'll learn and we'll move on and learn from that experimentation, so that even if we don't reach utopia, we can at least busy ourselves trying to reach it with our families and communities. Yeah.
One thing I find really interesting about the concept of utopia itself is that utopia is essentially like a steady state, right? The idea is that you achieve something and then you stay there forever, right? And I think that there's always a sense that like we're going to grow into that steady state, instead of maybe accepting that we that steady state is not possible. Change is one of the most fundamental aspects of human life, right? But that, like, in a way, like the functional definition of utopia was basically like the Middle Ages, right? Like, which we consider the Dark Ages, but like things just didn't change a lot for several generations. And it also completely depends on what part of the world you're talking about. There were parts of the world that were massively changing during that period, right? But I find it very interesting. So here's one of my my concerns with localism, right? Is just simply that right now the system creates massive amounts of trauma and destruction, right? But it's fairly good at hiding it in the wings away from the main global players, if you will. Like, they just sort of hide it in places and pretend it didn't happen. Like, I think we love to like ignore the literal trail of bodies that came behind modernity, right? Like, modernity required like 10,000 dead Chinese to build the Intercontinental Railroad. It required millions of slaves. It required, it just required all of this devastation, right, in order to happen. But we just swept it under the rug. We just pretend those are externalities to the building of the modern world. And I think one of the biggest pushbacks to localism, or kind of collapsing down to a more local thing, is that you can get situations like with Texas, right? Where Texas has a regional electricity system that utterly failed. And then you have this catastrophic failure in a local area. Iowa last year got hit, or maybe the year before, got hit with that Derico, right? Like that random mid-continental hurricane, right? Well, if Iowa's entire agricultural system was there, the state would have starved, right? It would have been a massively horrible famine situation for them, right? The system saved them, right? The scale of the system saved them. And I wonder, like, I think that one of the things, and I think I'm kind of teeing you up, Jason, because I think cosmopolitan localism or bioregionalism is sort of, to me, that feels like the answer, is the ability to still share information and resources across bioregions, but that you're largely self-sufficient within some sort of boundary. I wonder what you guys think about that. I just kind of think, for me, that's the number one pushback I have against localism, is instead of just having like large sacrifice zones, you just have like areas that just suffer because of natural processes, and no one can help them because there's no sharing, there's no ability to help these areas. Also, the smaller the area, the more able it's to be captured in a way by an autocrat. Like, they can just, the right strong arm with the right group of people with guns can sort of take over a whole area. And that seems to be a natural devolving point from large scale global empires. It seems like the natural devolution is into strongman autocracies. So I'm just throwing that back out at you, not in a antagonistic way. I'm very sympathetic to that, the localist viewpoint. I'm just sort of bringing that up to see what you guys have to say about it.
I've made pretty much the exact same criticisms as yourself, and they're ones that I haven't quite been able to account for. And right now, I'm just kind of at the point of saying, we know something is incredibly wrong with the system. We know we have to make some level of change, and it's good that we're at least thinking of these second and third order impacts to not reverting, but I guess just converting to a more local system of control and trade. But you're absolutely right, and having read a lot of what Jason's wrote about cosmopolitan localism, I would also tend to agree that we're going to need some level of regional trade, even some level of global trade. As I said, I'm certainly not going to discount the miracles that the modern market has done, at least in terms of getting people necessities consistently that they may have not have had access to otherwise, especially if they're hit with some sort of a big natural disaster. So some range of wide trade and connection, I think, is pretty much at a point of no return. We're pretty much not going to be able to totally lock ourselves out, remove all roadways and ways to a place, and call ourselves like a little walled off paradise slice of earth. But like you said, having at least all of the absolute essentials, most of the other everyday amenities and wants covered in a local supply chain, or at least a regional supply chain, is ideal in terms of resiliency, and not letting bad actors take advantage of these giant national and global level markets. So there's a balance, right? It's this oscillation between wanting to just live with a group of 20 people and then, wanting to still reap the benefits of cities and the productivity of 2 million people and 2 square miles. And the last thing, which will also set Jason up to maybe talk about oscillations here, and maybe we can get to some metamodernism talk, is this idea of progress and utopia in modernity, right? With modernity came this really heavy idea of linear progress, right? That progress kind of just goes up on a line, and like it's not going to get much worse from what we've developed. And in my view, in my assessment of history, we kind of have these little flutters. You need times of decline against which to rebound for further progress. So it's more little times of decline, but with a general positive trend upwards. And I think that's a very Doomer Optimist way to look at history and progress as well, because it's saying we might need times of decline where the things we've built break down in order to realize where we need to build and further propel ourselves towards a better future, right? It's very much linked to that popular concept of anti-fragility, that some things grow stronger under stress and failure. And I think that's also under this broad umbrella of Doomer Optimism, of the oscillation of progress and the inevitability of suffering as actually a key creative part of human history.
Well, I think I don't know if you set me up as much as preempted me. I think you said a lot of the things that I would say. And
I'm sorry to steal your line.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Well, I mean, I think that's a good critique, Tress. And for me, localism is more of a balancing, right? So we've gone so far in kind of the globalized extractive economy direction that, for me, when I'm kind of pungently advocating for localism, it's with the knowledge that I'm not expecting the whole world to suddenly become localists. Right. It's more of like, at the margins, can we get people to localize some of their dependencies, right? Can we get them to get involved with community organizations, local agriculture at the margins, because we've gone so far off in the other direction, right? But that's not to say that there's not, again, some kind of, well, one, I like the term minimum viable scale, because it acknowledges, I mean, that what that means in practice can be debated, right? Because, in some senses, the minimum viable scale, I think, is planetary for trade of some items, right? Some raw material resources if we're wanting to use electronics, and certain machinery and materials, but also, in terms of mutual aid, having the capacity to, having the cosmopolitan element of localism, where, and there's a tension there, right? In one part of our lives, we're building a local community, but I don't think that creating these walled off paradises or becoming isolated, to me, like the isolationist trend of localism, like if the whole world were to move in that direction, I don't think the outcome would be good either. I think it would be bad in a whole new set of ways, right? And so, the cosmopolitan element of, it's good for people to travel, of course, flying on airplanes is problematic now because of emissions and stuff, but it's good for people to travel. It's good for people to experience other cultures. It's good for there to be exchange of thoughts, exchange of some materials, exchange of mutual aid when appropriate. I think that can enrich, if it's done in a non kind of colonial way, where one culture is imposing its values on another, but it's done in a context of mutual exchange, then I think it's extremely positive, right? And so, in terms of like, what is the kind of the meta stability, like the kind of larger scale meta stability that localism can thrive in, I think that's an open question. And I don't think, the models of the past, like the model that we're kind of seeing now is, kind of a technocratic, kind of, you could say technocratic neoliberal capitalism, kind of progressive, but still, mediated through algorithms, impersonal algorithms, things of that nature. I don't think that's the answer, what we have now. And I don't necessarily think something like monarchy that we saw in the past is the answer either, right? But, what is it? And I don't think anybody really knows. I think a lot of people are kind of venturing in that territory and thinking about it. But if I were to put out a guess, it would be, some kind of emergent consensus that can, arise at larger scales through the affordances of digital technology that we have today. And particularly, advances in the internet, Web3, I think, is, the internet moving in a positive direction. It's more peer-to-peer, it's not defined necessarily by algorithms, but by human values that are kind of, imprinted on those algorithms. We're gonna have to have nested scales of management of things like, ecological flows. Our atmospheric commons is global. The impacts, and for example, things like the refugee crisis that is certainly coming in the hundreds of millions, that's a global scale problem because it's coming from the pollution of our global atmospheric commons, right? Bioregional scale, watershed scale, like these are all nested scales that there needs to be some kind of coherence at each scale in a way that's not that's not oppressing the smaller scales, but at the same time is providing some coherence for one, my village and the next village over, the ways that we interact with each other, some elements of that have to make sense in a larger, say, bioregional coherence, right? In terms of managing a watershed, managing topsoil, managing various species, their niche range or whatever, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess that's what I would add to your preemption.
Absolutely. And to touch on that tension between cosmopolitan localism, Doomer optimism, Doomer bloomer, right? I think that this kind of stark contrast in a lot of these ideas and terms that we're working with here is exactly the point, right? It's that there's a middle ground to be found, but you kind of have to understand both ends of that extreme in order to find your footing and to choose what sort of action you're willing to take. And to link this to metamodernism, they have the great concept of both neither, right? We're both and neither modernity and postmodernity, right? We take aspects of both. We look at modernity through the postmodern lens, and postmodernity we take the insights of postmodernity into this postmodern age. And I think the both neitherness of Doomer optimism is pretty strong, in that a Doomer optimist isn't really a doomer. There's a clear distinction there. If you just called them a traditional optimist, most of them would seem to disagree. And so there is a very specific, both neither, in between, state of metaxy here in the Doomer optimist movement. And I think that's part of our historical place as well. I think we're in an era of transition and change and upheaval, and it seems that's when we get these oomers, right? That was another observation, is you saw these oomer phrases, like, if boomer is truly the first one and we take it in the literal baby boomer sense, well, that's the great post-World War II change and transformation, one of the biggest the world has ever seen, and we get the boomer, right? And we get the doomer right there. Its first usage is there with the peakniks there at peak oil, and then we get the zoomer here immediately with the post 9/11 internet era, right? And so all these oomers, Doomer optimist included, I think, are also characterized by their placement historically in times of change and transformation. And that's why it's hard to pinpoint where we are on one side or the other and all these things, is because it's really, we're both neithers. As much as we're Doomer optimists, both neithers. And I think that's a good place to be. It's uncomfortable. In the Doomer Bloomer oscillation, I noted it's uncomfortable sometimes to have to try and reconcile your Doomer black pill takes with your Bloomer white pill ones. Your state is someone who is really optimistic about their future, but really nihilistic about that of humanity as a whole. So I think I would just, for people who may be listening to this and confused about how much of this seems contradictory, I'd say to kind of lean into it. Because that's one of the things I think clicks with a lot of people with the Doomer optimist phrase, is they say, yeah, I'm both, and I didn't realize I could call myself both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think and I'm not growing things the way you are, Jason, but like, one of the things that is very that has been very transformational for me in trying to grow things is it requires an acceptance of just messiness, right? It requires an acceptance of, like, nature is messy. Like the way things naturally proceed, life is messy. Kids are messy, right? The way your adult life, the way you try and make it work among all of these competing, pressures, it's messy. In fact, sort of like, the best case scenario is you're sort of like holding all of these things and they're perfectly like laid against each other, so they're actually in balance, but it's a mess, right? At any moment the whole thing could just come apart. And I think that, like, that is actually life, right? In all generations, every human generation, that has been life. But modernity has really, like, convinced us that we somehow escaped that. And I think one of the things that the kind of like decade, like every decade we have a new, like, generational crisis. Like, my entire adult life has been 9/11, financial crisis, like, now we've got COVID. It's just been like one, unprecedented crisis after another, one black swan after another, right? Which now is just like, oh, this is the way it is. But then when you start to think about it, it's like, okay, wait, before this we had Oklahoma City bombing and the first Iraq war, and before that we had the Satanic Panic, and it's like in the crack epidemic, and before that we had Watergate, and before that we had Vietnam. It's like you start going back and you're like, oh, wait a second, this is actually just the state of things. This is human life, right? And the thing, when you're in a moment of these kind of acute crises, it becomes the world tells you that life is fragile and chaotic and can end at any moment. But that's actually always been the case. It's just now the external world is like reminding us that at any moment I could go get smacked by a bus, right? At any moment, I'm on borrowed time, you're on borrowed time, we're all on borrowed time. We have this moment on Earth, and it's chaotic, and we do the best we can with the time we're given. And I think I may be going off on a tangent here, which may be a little bit late in the game to be going off on a tangent, but I think you touched on something earlier that I think like, especially American modern living is very death phobic. Like we're really freaked out about death. And I think part of it is that like, because as we abandoned religion, right, we abandoned a lot of the like rituals around accepting these kind of key things. We all are born, most all of us get married, most all of us have children, and all of us die, right? Like these are these kind of key things, and religion really helps kind of solidify how you're supposed to celebrate those things, right? And modernity has not given us any kind of replacement for that. And so death is scary. We're all freaked out of it. Every human ever has probably been freaked out about it. But modernity has not given us a response for that. They've given us Botox and cryogenic extension, life extension. Like they've given us these lies that we somehow can escape death. And I think like the acceptance of it, like the acceptance of the fundamental necessity of it, right, was one out in a way. That's one Doomer optimism out, is that if you're not as afraid of dying and you're not afraid, if you're not as afraid of it, basically, if you accept it as part of living, then a lot of these problems are not actually problems that have to be solved, right? And I think about like a very profound moment for me was during COVID last year, I took a lot of hikes, like every day, like an hour and a half hike. And it dawned on me one day as I looked around that this is a graveyard. Like I am surrounded by death in all directions. I am walking on dead bodies, right? Like everything is death. It's fallen leaves, it's dying animals, it's dying trees. And yet it's beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. What I was going to for solace was just the whole life cycle happening in front of me. And I think that like, one of the fundamental things we're trying to achieve with Doomer optimism, or trying to achieve in these conversations, is an understanding of what part of this cycle are we in? How are we moving on? Because empires die, people die, neighborhoods die, cities die, like everything dies. And if we're dying, what does that mean? Because we know from nature that doesn't mean the end. We know it doesn't mean the end. And I think that that's where the Doomer optimism comes from me, as I know this isn't the end. And I think that, and I also know that spring comes after the winter, right? And in fact, winter necessitates spring, right? Like these things, they all work in tandem. And growing things, to kind of get back to my original point, is the growing things has really kind of helped me having like a tangible like experience with that messiness and life and death, and like that, like you just grab a weed and you just tear it up and throw it back on, because that's needed for new plants to grow and all the good things that come from life.
And it gets to that contradiction once again, from death stems life, right? There's kind of a phoenix nature to most things in this world. And we are often all too keen to take ourselves out of that view, when death in many ways seems to be one of the most profound links to eternity for all people, not to the end. There's a great book out there. I can't remember the author, but it's called Worm at the Core, if I recall correctly. And it's about modern society's aversion towards talking about and thinking about death in an honest way, and the negative impact that can have. And inversely, the positive impact that thinking about death in a happy, kind of optimistic way can really have. I think that if we do embrace our role as being towards death, we do end up having a healthier worldview, a healthy outlook instead of actions that we take. And that's something that, once again, my background, one of my degrees is in Russian, and so I read a lot of Russian literature in college, and a classic bit is The Death of Ivan Ilyich, right? And one of the major points of that book is that this dying man, Ivan Ilyich, he's upset that people, his family in particular, won't just admit that he's dying, right? They go out of their way to skirt around the issue, to push it under the rug, and to act as though it's just any other ailment when he knows he's dying and he just wants to be recognized as such, as a dying man. And the only one that'll do it is this kind of naive, slow peasant guy who gets it, right? And he forms this bond with him at the end. And I think that there's, as you would expect with a great writer like Tolstoy, so much modern truth packed in there, even to this day, about how I think kind of the Doomer Optimist spirit is to be recognized as someone facing the potential for catastrophe and major crisis in this life, but who would greatly benefit if you just admitted it, because at least then maybe you can have a productive solution, or admit, which I don't think is the case, that maybe there isn't one. But nevertheless, you have a dialogue that I think we're all just needing to have. Too many people want to say, we're not in a crisis, things really aren't that bad, and there's truth in that. Things aren't all doom and gloom, and we shouldn't be thinking like totally black-pilled accelerationist, it's always going to fall apart type people. But I think a lot of people find it to be almost confusingly a breath of fresh air to say, yeah, things are whack, crap's bonkers out there in the world, but like admitting that's the first step. It sounds cliche, but I think that that's at the core of this Doomer Optimist movement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This might be, I don't know, too much of a tangent, perhaps close to wrapping up, but I'm curious. So are you Russian?
I am not by ethnicity, no, at least not in like the strictest sense. I picked it up by happenstance, actually. You have to take a language at the University of Montana to get a degree. Everyone does like Spanish and German and French. I didn't want to do any of those. They'd be packed. Like Arabic and Chinese sound way too hard, but Russian seemed like a good middle ground. I had Russian neighbors growing up here in Montana. I had like a really good Russian speaking exchange friend from the east of Ukraine in high school. And so I had several reasons to sign up for the class. And I just fell in love with it. I fell in love with learning a foreign language, with the culture, history, literature. It's just, I think it's a pretty Doomer Optimist country, right? You see in Doomer wave music, which is linked to this whole cultural movement, Doomer wave music is oftentimes stylized with Soviet apartment blocks in the background and the Soviet kind of bleak cinder block aesthetic, and oftentimes does slowed reverb versions of old like late Soviet era and post Soviet fall music. And so I think that my experience with Russian authors like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and my experience in the culture there and my time in Siberia definitely impacted my thinking and influenced me in this Doomer Optimist direction. There's a great concept in the Russian language, one of those untranslatable things called toska. And toska at its core is like this vague longing and sense of existential angst and sort of uncomfortableness that you can never quite put your finger on, right? And the Russians call that toska. And I think that a lot of Doomers have that sense of toska and just want someone to admit it and to share it with. Because I think, Jason, I wanted to note this earlier, you really pounded in that people feel like Doomer Optimists. They hear the word and they feel that it describes them accurately, and it accurately describes whatever their blend of Doomer Optimism may be before they hear the term. So just wanted to point that out as well, that there's not a list of things, all the things we talked about here. If you don't check all the boxes on it, doesn't mean you're not a Doomer Optimist, because most people who latch onto this phrase latch onto it purely because of the intuitive feeling of thinking that it describes accurately enough what you believe.
Well, it sounds like Doomer Optimism might be your gateway drug to Orthodox Christianity.
It very well may be, right? There's a lot of links there. We talked about Dostoyevsky and the Russian culture, and I think that there is a big link there. There's a lot of ideas of the inevitability of suffering, but the holiness of it in the Orthodox faith, right? Faith. And well, I guess in a way that it is fate to suffer, but that there's a holiness and divine nature in that suffering, and that that active love as a lot of those Orthodox elders will preach, is often the solution to our small and large scale social woes.
Yeah,
that's about all I have. That I've thoroughly exhausted my months and months of thinking about Doomer optimism in a formal sense. So there's no one better to have done it with, for sure.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been really. I mean, I just love all these conversations because they just go in crazy places. Like they just go wherever they're going to go, and it's just such a joy to be a part of this. Thank you so much for joining us today in our kind of classic, bit here. Give us one last word. What is the one last thing you really want to leave people with?
If you've listened to this whole thing, you're probably already a Doomer optimist. But if you're not, I'd greatly implore you to consider what those words can mean to you, what you find doomy in life, and what you're optimistic about. Try and link the two, figure out why you feel those ways. And if you're not already a Doomer optimist, I think there's a very, very, very good chance you are one, or you'll be one day. And so, like the fine folks at that, like the fine folks at the Libertarian Party said when they decided to run Gary Johnson, most people are libertarians and they just don't know it yet. I'm not sure about that statement, but I am confident that most people are Doomer optimists and just don't know it yet.
I think after this conversation, I would have to say that most